Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. Welcome to another episode. Today we have Vanessa Ridaura on with us today, and she is a PhD. She's done her PhD as well as her postdoc. She did her PhD in genetic genomics at the University of Washington in St. Louis and came out with some amazing results that she's going to talk to us about today. She specializes in how the microbiomes affect human health and disease. She also did her postdoc, I believe, at the National Institute of Health in Maryland's.
Mm-hmm.
Vanessa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Excellent. I was delighted to have you on the show and amazed at your studies and what you've learnt. Would absolutely love it if you could share today what you've learnt and maybe even give us some examples of experiments that you did with respect to the microbiome. I believe that your PhD was more around the metabolism, obesity, and leanness in relation to the microbiome. Can you give us a rundown of what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what I was trying to understand during my PhD is how the gut-associated microbiota affects human health and disease, and specifically their metabolism. And so maybe I can give you a little bit of a background of what microbiota is. The microbiota refers to all of those microbes, so bacteria and archaea and viruses and even some yeast that live in association with different epithelial surfaces of your body. So like your oral cavity or your skin or your gut. And because we are not sterile human beings, many of these members of the microbiota actually have beneficial effects on our health. So it's not that all bacteria are bad and are going to cause disease, but they actually can boost our immune system, can help us and can protect us against pathogenic bacteria by taking over the places where these pathogenic bacteria might be living, and therefore displacing them. And so living with microbes around us is actually a good thing. And so during my PhD, I was trying to understand how these microbes, or this microbiota, actually affected metabolism. And specifically, I was studying how it affected obesity and leanness and obesity-associated diseases such as type 2 diabetes. So what I was doing, I was working with a model where we use germ-free animals, and that ensures that the animal is born and reared germ-free, so no associated microbiota. And then we can give these animals the microbiota that we are interested in understanding. And so what I would do is would give these animals the microbiota from twins that were discordant for obesity. So a human twin that was lean and a human twin that was obese. And what I observed is that these animals, the ones that received the microbiota from the human lean twin, would actually lose weight, while the ones that received the microbiota from the obese twin would actually gain weight, even if the animals were fed the exact same healthy diet. So that was super interesting.
Okay, so Vanessa, just to recap then, so how many mice were you sort of testing at this stage?
We tested a lot of mice, and so they were basically all genetically identical mice. So we did this experiment several times, and we would give the same microbiota maybe to 10 or 15 mice every time we did the experiment.
Okay, and every single time the mice that had the lean microbiome became lean or stayed lean on the same diet as the obese ones became obese?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and so it was interesting, but we actually noticed that if we switched the diet, then this wouldn't be the case. Now, if we gave them a diet that was based on a human unhealthy diet that was high in saturated fats, so like pizza and burgers and cheese and tons of milk, then these animals would actually, the ones that had the lean microbiota would actually gain weight. And the ones that had the obese microbiota would gain weight as well. So the effects of a microbiota would be basically nullified by having an unhealthy diet. And the hypothesis was that the components of a healthy diet, like plants, so vegetables, tons of greens, those components actually feed the beneficial bacteria in your gut and help them survive. While if you're not eating this and instead you're substituting with these negative fats, not only are the fats affecting your metabolism directly, but you're also getting rid of the bacteria that would have these beneficial effects.
So could you conclude then, based on just your study, that if your microbiome was all in check and you had that, say, lean microbiome, and you ate a healthy diet, then you would remain healthy. But if you didn't, and you just end up the same and become obese anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, of course, genetics associated with it as well that we are not taking into consideration here, like the genetics of the twins that gave us their samples. But interestingly, right, we were receiving samples from identical twins, so monozygotic twins, so twins that are, some exceptions, perfectly identical. And one of them was obese and the other one was lean. And the main difference, or the difference that we were observing, was in their microbiome. So yes, of course, there are going to be components of your genetic background that are going to also affect your metabolism, but the microbiota is also going to play a very important role in how you react to certain foods.
Offline, you mentioned a bit about the feces eating.
Oh, yes. One of the experiments that we were interested in doing to understand if we could have microbiota transplants, for example, was to transfer the microbiota from a lean mouse or individual into a mouse that already had the microbiota of an obese mouse. But one of the problems with that is that a single dose is not enough. So what we did was we co-housed these animals and we staged basically a battle of the microbiotas. And the reason that we co-housed the animals is that mice are coprophagic. That means that they eat each other's feces. And so we could guarantee a continuous colonization of each other's guts with each other's microbiomes. We were hypothesizing that the obese microbiome was actually going to take over the lean microbiome and everyone was going to get fat. But in the context of a healthy diet, we observed exactly the opposite. Animals that were consuming this healthy diet and were co-housed with an animal that had an obese microbiota, actually we saw the lean microbiota take over the obese microbiota, and now the animals that were previously obese were now lean, and their microbiota looked exactly like that of the lean microbiome. This was not the case when these battles of the microbiota were staged in the context of a unhealthy, high-fat diet.
Wow. So just to confirm then, the obese and the lean mice that were eating a healthy diet all stayed together, and because they were eating each other's feces, they ended up all being lean, even the obese mice.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So even the lean mice that I assume were eating the obese mice's feces still became lean because of the healthy diet.
Yeah, and the combination of the healthy diet and their microbiome.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Perfect. And then, so what did you observe after that?
A lot of those things were associated with the way that the microbiota was digesting the food. And so the healthy diet was based on a plant-based diet. And so we could identify pathways that these microbes were using to break these plant-based foods and then affect the metabolism of the host by the secondary metabolites that they were producing, for example, short chain fatty acids. And so it was interesting to know that, or to see that having these good bacteria in combination with this good diet was producing these metabolites that were in turn being able to alter the host metabolism. But as we were talking earlier, this is a very young field. And so we couldn't really pinpoint exactly which bacteria were doing this or exactly which metabolites were doing this, if it was one or the other. It was more like a suite of metabolites and a lot of different bacteria. And I think that this is a very young field, that it's changing quickly. And so we know now for sure that your metabolism is affected by your gut microbiome, the same as immunity, but we don't know exactly how to play with that microbiome to switch your metabolism as we want it, at will, basically. So we're still working on that.
Like, are you talking about transplants of feces and that sort of thing? Because I know that goes on, but you think that they still haven't had enough proof within humans as to whether that works?
The only context that I'm aware of that human fecal transplants happened is in the context of C. difficile. So C. difficile is an infection that happens. Let's say that you go to the hospital and you take tons of antibiotics for some unrelated reason. Basically, these antibiotics are cleaning or killing all of your healthy microbiota that you had to begin with. And so that basically opens up all of these spaces for this bad bacteria called C. difficile to take over. And so normally the first line of treatment is given different antibiotics that target C. difficile, but sometimes those don't work. And so now they've started doing fecal microbiome transplants in which they give a healthy, very diverse microbiome that can actually displace C. diff. And that's now FDA approved, if I'm not mistaken, procedure, but it's the only fecal microbiome transplant that's done therapeutically and that's been shown to work.
Okay, so it sounds like there's still a lot more needed research before any big changes happen, but that must have been fairly enlightening just for yourself. Has that study alone changed the way you perhaps live your life in terms of diet?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of the people, the scientists that work in this field, we are very struck by how little things can really influence how your body as a whole works. So definitely eating tons of sugar, simple sugars, that's going to make it easier for the bacteria that are associated with obesity to spread and bloom in your gut. And so I try to limit that. I try to limit eating high-fat diets all the time, for sure eating more vegetables. And what was interesting from the study is that there's no magic bullet. I think that a lot of people in the field were hoping to be like, oh, no matter what, a lean microbiome is always going to make you lean. But that's not the case. You still have to eat healthy, just the same healthy eating that's been known for decades now. Plenty of vegetables, low in fat, low in saturated fats, etc. It's nothing really that new. It's just we're finding new ways where diet has an impact.
It's funny, isn't it? We always come back to what we know, but it's nice to have that scientific proof or just to see it in mice and just to see how it actually really doesn't matter if you're lean. If you don't eat well, then you're not going to be healthy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting to always remember that there are no magic bullets when it comes to losing weight or when it comes to being healthy. What we've known for a long time, it's what works. So just stick to that and you should be okay. It's just we're finding new ways in which this particular way of eating actually is positive. And it's the same with the cancer field. We're finding new ways in the cancer field in which eating a lot of sugar can actually increase your chances for having cancer develop. We knew sugar was bad. Excessive sugar is bad, but now we have another way that explains why it's bad. Kind of sticking to the basic.
You're particularly interested in obesity and leanness, but also diabetes and particularly type 2. Did you sort of make any conclusions around that?
Yeah, so interestingly, those same animals. So remember, when I started my experiment, the animal that I start with is a completely healthy animal. And then I just give it the obese microbiota. Those animals that receive the obese microbiota versus the lean microbiota and were eating a healthy diet had increased branched-chain amino acids in their muscles. And that has been a biomarker an early biomarker for development of type 2 diabetes. So they didn't develop full-blown out diabetes when they were just in a healthy diet, but just having the obese microbiome had the early signs, made these animals develop early signs of type 2 diabetes. We also didn't give them enough time to develop type 2 diabetes. The experiments were rather short for the context of the development of this disease, but we could already see within 2 weeks that you were seeing these early signs of type 2 diabetes, which is like increased branched-chain amino acids in muscle.
So potentially then, in layman terms, they were more susceptible to get diabetes type 2.
Absolutely.
But could prevent it from happening if they had a healthy diet.
Absolutely.
Well, that's great news. That's really interesting. So you really concentrated then on the gut microbiome. And then you moved into doing your postdoc at the National Institute of Health in Maryland?
Yeah.
The postdoc. And then there you decided to move into microbiome with regards to the skin.
Correct.
Okay.
So as I told you at the beginning, the bacteria are associated with different epithelial surfaces. And of course, the skin is one of the ones that it's most readily contact with the environment. And what I was interested in doing there is understanding how that microbiota could affect locally the immune system and how that affecting the immune system could actually have a relevant effect in other more inflammatory type diseases such as psoriasis or atopic dermatitis.
How did you go about researching that?
In a similar way as what I've described with the gut, the skin is a very interesting environment. A single species can colonize very localized part of your skin. Doesn't happen in the gut. You can't, in an already colonized gut, you cannot introduce one single species that's not a pathogen. But we can do that in the skin. And so using, again, animals, we could put a single bacteria species on their skin. And these animals, in this case, were not germ-free. They were normal animals that had a complete set of microbes. We could study how that changed different aspects of their immunity. And we can see that there are certain species, and this study is not yet published, but will be published soon, certain species of bacteria that were from the skin that could potentially increase inflammation in the skin of these animals.
We'll read your in-depth study, but you probably don't know off the top of your head. I guess moving forward, and I know it's a fairly scientific study, but obviously just on a basic level, you can see how quite easily psoriasis or dermatitis, these different skin diseases can form. Would you have a takeaway message from that?
Yeah, so again, many of these diseases have an underlying genetic predisposition, but again, your diet, we had a component of these experiments where we gave mice a high-fat diet and then colonized them with this bacteria, and that made the disease even worse. So again, having a high-fat diet can actually make a skin disease even worse. And so just having the high-fat diet, by the way, just as a basal level without the bacteria, can also make your skin more prone to inflammation. And so in general, you can see now that there's kind of like a topic going forward where this diets that are high in saturated fats and these bad fats actually can increase inflammation. And this was already known, but what wasn't known is that it can increase inflammation in your skin as well as in your gut. And this is associated with many other diseases, like in the skin, for example. If you're already prone to psoriasis and now you're eating a high-fat diet, then you're going to get more psoriatic breaks. And so one way to fix that would be to eat less high-fat diet.
When you say high-fat diet, you're not talking about good fats in terms of nuts, avocados, olive oils. You're talking bad fats like
saturated fats.
Right, yeah, sunflower oil and all the bad fats. Okay, great.
Right.
Once again, I guess it's similar outcome, isn't it? It's all rocket science, but at the same time, it's fairly practical.
Exactly.
You mentioned the microbiome has a lot to do with gut, and then you also said that it's sort of easier to see its effects on the skin, or at least come to more conclusions on the skin. Do you think science is a little further ahead with respect to microbiome in the skin versus the gut?
Actually, the other way around. But we are, science is a lot more further ahead with the gut than in the skin. Skin is really new. People just started studying the skin maybe in the last 5 years, and the gut microbiome has been studied for maybe the last 15 to 20 years. But still, it's only the breaks in technology that have allowed us to really make the groundbreaking discoveries. And so things like sequencing for really cheap and doing mass spec for cheaper than before, all these like huge technological advances are making us be able to study this further. And so that's why it's just around now that we're making all this bigger discoveries in regards to the microbiome.
And where does microbiome of the mouth fit in terms of where we're at?
There is also not a huge research field that it's focused in the oral microbiome, but there are a couple of studies showing that if you have periodontitis, so that's when you have like really inflamed gums and they are also have higher bacterial load. And if you're pregnant, for example, periodontitis in pregnancy is associated with low infant weight and it's associated with premature birth. There's a lot of dysbiosis of the mouth is also associated with things like arteriosclerosis. And it's not really known what the exact link is, but we know that there's a strong correlation between these things.
Funny you should say that. We just had Dr. Dan on the show. He's a periodontist in practice for 40 years. He said the exact same thing, that the mouth is sort of like the end point. Once it's in the mouth, they know it's come from the gut.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Where do you think science is going to go with this? If you had to sort of predict when we might have a bit more of an understanding about this. You mentioned 20 years we've been looking at the gut microbiome. Do you think it's going to be in the next 5, 10, 20 years' time, or do you think it's going to be even earlier? as to when we might have some definite
Answers?
treatments? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that for sure things like C. diff will continue to see a treatment, fecal microbiome transplants. And I think that more and more we're starting to understand how the gut microbiota is influencing different aspects of health and disease. And there's a lot of new research into cancer and how the gut microbiome can influence therapeutic cancer therapies. And I've seen a couple of early studies where there are humans that are giving a certain cancer therapy associated with a specific microbial transplant, but these studies are phase 1 still, so just safety. And so I would say maybe 10 or 15 years will we see strong links between, or strong intervention studies between the gut microbiota that will be commercially available.
And will that magic pill be commercially available then as well?
I think so.
Excellent. Look, that's great. And look, thank you very much, Vanessa, for coming on the show. If it's okay with you, I'd love to link to your PhD itself.
Absolutely. We can definitely do that.
Once you've released the study findings from your postdoc, we'll add that to the show notes. Thank you very much. And just before I let you go, Vanessa, I know your baby will wake up at any stage. And I think my daughter's due to wake up soon too. So we'll probably have 2 screaming kids in the background in a couple of minutes. But just before I let you go, random question that we ask all our interviewees, nothing to do with microbiome. Well, maybe it does. Do you have a tattoo?
I do not.
You don't?
No.
Okay. So if you were to get a tattoo, what would it be? And maybe even where would you put it?
I don't know what it would be. I will put it on my wrist. And I think that my tattoo would just be the words, "be kind," to remind me to be kind to everyone.
Oh, great. And so why don't you have that there already?
I don't know.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time, Vanessa.
Great. Thank you so much.
Excellent. See you later.
Bye-bye.
For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.